At dawn, the sea beyond Lannisport lay flat and pewter gray, a sheet of beaten metal without a ripple, as if the world had paused to contemplate its reflection. From the heights of Casterly Rock, the water looked as still as a lake. The gulls did not circle. The oars on the galleys at the long piers did not move. The banners along the causeway that spiraled from the city up to the gatehouse hung in the windless air and whispered nothing at all. A silence like a held breath pooled in the hollows of the cliff and in the vaulted halls within, where the stone remembered many kings who had never been kings and many lords who had not been merciful. Tyrion Lannister stood in a windowed passage cut through the rock centuries ago by men whose names were forgotten, watching the dawn decide whether it would come. To his left stretched a corridor lit only by the glow of lamps shuttered with thin sheets of polished horn. To his right, beyond the window's slit, the sky gathered a mild, pallid light, and the edge of the sea found its outline again and turned newly silver. His reflection lingered faint and stubborn on the window's glass. The dwarf with hair the color of old gold and a face not so much homely as used, lived in, full of old dents. Behind the reflection, the world was large. The rock was busy with quiet. Servants moved in twos, heads bowed, bearing ewers and dark cloths and baskets of salt and unguents. Priests softened their steps as if the floor were a sleeping thing set to wake at any clatter. The kitchens rolled out fresh white bread as if it were an ordinary morning, and the smell of it wandered up a stairway, then hesitated, aware of where it was going, and drifted back down. Somewhere unseen, a harp was being tuned. The sound of strings tightened, found, and tightened again, and then stilled. Even laughter, when it appeared, came thin and tentative, the sound of people remembering laughter from a distance. Tyrion thought, briefly, that he could not abide the hush. Then he wondered if it would offend anyone if he yawned spectacularly. He did neither. His hands, which had been clasped together in the habitual posture of expectation, some old habit in him that believed if he waited politely at the edge of any moment good news would eventually come. Unclasped, then clasped again. Below, the city's smoke rose in discreet ribbons. He had not seen his father's face since it had gone still. He had seen it in memory, not how a son saw a father, but how a witness saw a powerful creature at rest. The hard line of jaw, the wakes of pale skin at the corners of the mouth, the hungerless mouth itself. He had seen it from across tables at which he was permitted to sit but not to participate, and in war tents that smelled of wool and steel and damp horses, and in corridors where it passed without slowing, and in a mirror once, where his own face had caught his father's expression by accident and he had flinched in startlement, as if Tywin Lannister had stopped behind his shoulder to read the book he was not actually reading. It was not like a Lannister to die at his desk, but that was the manner of it. Had it been a boar's tusk or a blade in a back alley or fever that shook him down into nothing, Tyrion would have found it easier to contain his surprise. Men who ruled the world one moment and were dead the next made for better songs. His father had merely kept working. There were ledgers open, Tyrion had been told, and a quill upright in the ink as if awaiting a hand to return. There was wine in a cup that had cooled. There was wax on the desk in a small hardened flood, not scraped away. Tywin Lannister, who had measured his life in decisive movements, had been taken in the midst of one of the small transitions that knit those movements together. His body lay now in a chamber deeper within the rock where the walls were polished with age, so that even lamplight seemed to run in them like water. The priests had done what they do. Tyrion had gone in when summoned and seen the lion that would not wake. He had not kissed the brow. He did not think his father would have approved, being a man unsentimental even about victory, but he had stood a respectful time. There were banners in there, and a chair no one sat in, and next to the bed a basin with clean water that none of the servants would pour out yet. The air was heavy with the soft medicinal reek of herbs that pretended they were necessary when the work was already done. Behind Tyrion, deliberate footsteps. He did not turn at once. He knew the gait as one knows the sound of one's own name in a crowd. "Uncle Kevin," Tyrion said, "you look as though you have slept. I didn't imagine it was permitted." "It is permitted," Kevin Lannister replied, the voice steady. He came to stand beside Tyrion and looked out at the gray. "It is encouraged, in fact. There is much to do. Is it not always so?" The dead do not make lists. They do not leave notes saying whose grief is to be done first and whose can wait. Father would have, Tyrion said lightly. He would have assigned mourning by rank and rotated the black cloths on a schedule. Jonos should weep at second bell, 3 measures only. Ser Adam may sigh between noon and sundown provided he does it privately. Kevin's mouth softened. His hair had gone very white where Tywin's had only ever gone thin. The lines of his face were kinder. A man could be overshadowed by his brother and not resent it so much as adapt, and that had been Kevin's way. To run the estate lines true while the Lord of Casterly Rock drew them. Tyrion, he said, and something in the way he said the name made it not a reprimand. He was proud of you. Tyrion let out a sound that could have done the work of laughter if laughter were strong enough to push through the throat of a morning like this. Proud? Of me? In his fashion. Kevin's reflection in the window was weary and nearly invisible. After the Green Fork, when word came that you had held, and that you had not retreated when every sensible part of the sense said you should, yes. He said little. You know how he was. But to me, this private treasury of fatherly warmth I was never to spend. Tyrion cut in, though without heat. Keep it, uncle. It is a valuable coin and should not be wasted on a witless dwarf with bad habits. You were his son, Kevin said. Indeed, Tyrion murmured, and because the bleak little joke surfaced of its own accord, he added, and he died at his desk. On that point we match. It was not like Tywin to leave a confusion in his wake. He had left orders. He had left strong rooms full of coin and more coin in the ground. He had left an army not yet summoned, and liege lords who would answer when they were, and cousins who would align themselves as iron shavings align around a magnet. He had left a wife long buried and a daughter on a throne and a son in white and a son in shadow. He had left the rock tighter than a clenched fist. He had left a kingdom in which a king did not know he had enemies and enemies who did not know they had a king. It is the same rock, Kevin said, as if he had been following Tyrion's thoughts down their narrow stairs. The same sea, the same silver in the veins. I am not the man your father was. I do not pretend to be, but the house stands. There will be hours to argue about what it means to stand. Today is not such an hour. Jenna is arrived from the East Road. Davin is in Lannisport seeing to the harbor flags. Maester Kraylin attends the body. We will allow the city to pass through the halls to mark him. They are already gathering. Can you stomach that labor, or shall I spare you? Tyrion considered the day as if it were a dish at table and he were deciding which bite to take first. There would be faces. Men from the forges with the hammer smell still on their clothes. Girls who carried water for those men and looked as though they could carry men if they wished. Old women with saints' rings. Boys who had been given their father's belt to hold because they would feel taller that way. They would look at the open doors carved with the leaping lions, at the mosaic of the first Lannister casting his shadow inland, at the tapestries whose gold threads glinted even in sorrow. They would be conscious of their boots on the stone and the trouble of their hands. Tyrion could stand beside something that made him taller than his height and use a voice he had kept oiled for just such days. Friendly, iron-edged, capable of turning aside pity without breaking its arm. I will stand, he said. It will give them comfort, and me a stiff neck. Kevin nodded, as if a task had been checked off a list, and a small part of Tyrion loved him for that. He had always trusted lists. From some passage deeper within, a bell began to toll. Its sound came like a wave through the rock and went out into the morning, moved across the cliff face and into the city and over the harbors and the black ships with their shining oars. Lannisport stirred late and together. Doors opened. Men lifted their heads. You will not speak with the priests? Kevin asked. Tyrion lifted one shoulder. I have always found that the gods and I do not share vocabulary. Let them say what they like. I will listen with an expression of thoughtful gravity that will make them feel wise. You see, I honor him. We must right the queen, Kevin said. And now the words stood in the corridor like an officer, requiring attention. We must right her sons. We must right the king. Ah, Tyrion said, and the sound contained the story of his sister and himself, which was too complicated and too simple for one breath. Yes, right, the queen. Father's daughter will prefer a letter that tells her what she already believes. And what is that? That the realm cannot do without a Lannister at its head, Tyrion said gently, and then he did smile, because Kevin's mouth twitched in answer, and because humor felt less like betrayal than grief did. On that point, she will not be wrong. They went together through the hallway where the windows ran like narrow eyes, down stairways that had worn shallow curves into themselves with the weight of centuries of feet. The guards at the doors stood like carved men. When Tyrion stepped out into the great hall with its high rafters and the littering of spears along the wall, the smell of oil and iron and ash welcomed him as it had in childhood. He imagined he could still feel the press of his father's hand on the place a man's shoulder would be, though the hand had never been set there. The household had gathered. Jenna Lannister, tall and broad and dressed in heavy mourning that she wore like armor, stood with Emmon Fry at her side, who looked as though he would prefer to be anywhere other than where he was. Davin had sent a boy in his stead with a message. The outer piers were already hung with black, and fishing boats, sturdiest of the city's fleet, had flung tar that morning as if preparing for a storm. They took their places and let the doors be flung wide. They came as all people do, in all the shapes of humanity, the wealthy in unadorned black and the poor in whatever dark cloth could be found. They came with their hats in their hands and their clenched mouths. They came, some of them, because they had raised a cup in the rock's shadow and had worries they could not name about the shape of the shadow now. They came because it was the thing to do. They came because they wanted to see if the dwarf would look truly grieved or would wear that familiar sardonic tilt of face, and because whether he did one or the other would tell them something, though what it would tell them they could not agree. They came because for all that Tywin Lannister had made his cities and his men walk in the straightest lines, they had loved the lines as one loves a fence in winter that keeps the sheep from wandering to wolves. Tyrion stood, and he said the sort of words that appropriate and then refine themselves at moments like these, of service and vigilance and the work of building and the work of keeping what one has built. He said them because they were expected, and because in the saying of them a steady rhythm was made for people to align their breath to. He watched faces loosen slightly as he spoke, not with relief but with that small release that comes when an event is given its name. He saw a boy with a runny nose and an adoring gaze try not to wipe his nose on his sleeve in front of the dwarf who was speaking small jokes that did not diminish the serious. He saw an old smith with silver in his beard nod in time to each mention of iron. He saw a woman with a mark at the corner of her mouth that could have been a birthmark or a burn look steadily at him for a time and then down, as if acknowledging some private residence of sorrow that did not need anyone else's blessing. They filed past and filed past. The day became morning, then midday. The light moved along the wall like an hour being poured. When the last of them had gone and the household was permitted to ease its shoulders, Jenna came to him and took both his hands so sudden and rough that he almost stumbled. "You are the only one of us who can make them laugh and not feel wicked for it," she said. He forgot that that is a strength. Tyrion lifted his brows. "You are kind, Aunt. I am old, nephew," she said, and he could not help but like her for the way she said it. "And I am not fooled by jewels. It will be a long house without him. Do not let your sister eat it." "I intend to keep my fingers," Tyrion said, and Jenna's laugh barreled through her grief like a cart through wet streets, splashing bystanders, forcing them to step lively. Then she turned, and the moment ended, and there were other moments behind it waiting to be heard. Across the realm, ravens had gone with strips of wax and impressions of a lion's head in gold. They took different skies, stormless and storming, and in the hours that followed, the news fell into halls like a heavy coin dropped onto a table, and those who heard reached for it with different hands. In the Red Keep at King's Landing, Cersei read the letter twice. She did not allow her hand to shake or her mouth to soften. She had learned the practice of stillness from him, who now would no longer require it of her. When she had finished the second reading, she folded the parchment once, twice, and set it down as if the object itself had become too warm to hold. She was alone when she read it. She had found a way to be alone, even in rooms full of people who thought they had business with the queen. Her women had been dismissed, her maids were waiting beyond 2 doors, Pycelle and his Russells had not yet come, and Varys was not due for an hour at least. though Varys' sense of when and how one was due was an elastic one, subject to his own belief in what the realm needed and when. She stood by a window making a window's ordinary square of blue air and looked out beyond the city toward a horizon that did not show Casterly Rock but behaved as if it did. She saw in the blue what she had always seen when she thought of West. A cliff taller than sense, cut flat as a coin's face against the sky, and in it a door that admitted men and let women look at it only. "We will not go home," she said to the empty room. Speaking aloud to the air gave the sentence substance. This is home. Her father had not died for her to kneel in some granite red chamber and be a daughter again. He had died so that she should be what it had always been intended she would be when it was useful, a queen who made kings and unmade them. She turned from the window then and crossed to the table where the letter lay. She put her fingers on it and pressed lightly, feeling the impression of the seal in the parchment itself. The lion's head the careful hands in Lannisport had cut so many times that the blade knew the work. She remembered the last time she had seen her father in person. The smell of him, faint and clean like linen dried in winter. The way he had not looked at her when she had used the word love in front of him. The manner in which he had ignored a sob which had made the men around them twitch as if they had heard themselves blasphemed. He had taken her wrist once when she had been a girl and said something that had made the skin beneath his fingers cold and strong, and she had not forgotten. She had not forgiven either. The two were not mutually exclusive. She had learned that lesson well. The door opened and Jaime stood there, golden in a way the day was not, dressed in white and shadow both. He did not step in at once. There was a small thing in his eyes she recognized and did not immediately name. He closed the door behind him with his left hand, careful of the latch so it would not click too loudly, like a man arriving late to a prayer. "You know," he said. She lifted the letter by one corner and let it fall. "I know," she replied, "and you have come to ask me if I am all right." Jaime came farther into the room then, and she thought how even now he wore that step of his that contained both grace and refusal. No one moved like him. No one would ever move like him again, with that particular careless perfection. It was a thing a man might receive at birth if he had been born with a sword in his hand instead of a cry. He stood at the table, and his hand wanted to reach for her and did not quite. No letter, no seal could change the angle of his wrist as it hesitated. "I have come," he said carefully, "to ask you what you intend." Cersei sat, not because she needed to but because the act of arranging her body into a posture she had practiced for years steadied her. She placed her hands on either side of the letter. "I intend to do what he taught," she said. "I intend to make of this a story that ends the way I want it to. I intend to let them believe I am grieving in a manner that is acceptable and to grieve in the manner that I find profitable. I intend to keep the king from making any speeches about how merrily the boar will be hunted in spring, because my father is dead and therefore everything is different." Jaime's mouth moved into a small half-smile that had the quality of memory about it. "You sound like him." "I am him," Cersei said softly, and a heat in her chest that could have been anything climbed. "Where is the boy?" "Joffrey is at his archery," Jaime said, "and will be furious if the sun moves a finger width before he proves again that the world is smaller than his arrows. Tommen." Writing a letter to the lion he keeps under his pillow to tell it that the great lion in the west is gone, Jaime said dryly, and there was a tenderness there that Cersei recognized with contempt and love in equal measure. Myrcella is visiting with Septa Eglantine, who is teaching her that when one is sorrowful one must not allow one's hands to droop. Cersei's hands did not droop. She thought of the Septa's mouth, prim as a seam. "There will be those who suggest we go west," she said. "We will not. We cannot afford to appear to retreat. They will say we must honor him with some show of grief that looks like a journey. We will honor him with a kingdom." "We," Jaime said, with a lightness that contained his question. "We," she said, and the word tasted like metal on her tongue. Later, the king came, and a smell of ale with him, and the air arranged itself around the fact of him. Robert Baratheon had the afternoon in his clothes, the look of a man who could not be made to remember that afternoons depended on mornings to exist. He looked at Cersei and at the letter, and some small wary look passed over his face that was not grief but calculation about the cost of other men's griefs. "So," he said, "your father, dead," Cersei said. She did not waste the word "my" in front of father. "He died at his desk." Robert grunted, not so much at the content of the sentence as at the shape of it. "Not a bad way," he said after a moment. "Not so messy." Cersei kept her face composed. She thought of the boar and the blood on Robert's thighs that would one day come, and the men who would pretend they hadn't seen. "You will write the appropriate letter," she said. "Yes," Robert said, because the thing was true and necessary and cost him nothing to say. "Pycelle will draft it." "Pycelle will draft it for you to sign," Cersei said. Robert looked at her then, full, and some part of the old argument opened between them like a well-traveled road. He did not take it. He scratched at his beard instead and glanced toward the window where the day had reorganized itself into afternoon. "You'll not want me to go with you." "I will not go," Cersei said. He looked faintly surprised. He had been prepared to be inconvenienced, and now he was denied even that small coin by which a husband proves his willingness to be noble. "Ah," he said, and for a heartbeat there was in him a thought as quiet as a mouse in a church. "You'll hold the court." "I will," she said. "Then hold it," Robert said, and there was, for the first time that day, a tone in him that hinted at something like relief. He was a man who had valued the idea of a simple life and had been given a complicated one as a gift he had never wanted. The governance of sorrow was a thing he knew to give away. He looked once more at the letter. "He was a hard man," he said, almost to himself. "He always looked at me like I'd spilled something that he intended to wipe up himself. But he held things together. Even I could see that." Cersei inclined her head. "He did." Robert's mouth pried itself into a thin smile full of old and private humor. "Best thing he did was make you." "The best thing any man can do is recognize my value," Cersei said, and saw the smile blur just at its edges. Saw the king become the boy he had been for a strand of seconds. Saw the boy remember a goat path in Storm's End where he had chased a rabbit with a stick until his brother called him back to supper. He left, then, to go and pretend to write and actually to delegate, and he took with him the particular air that formed around him when he occupied a room, the smell of sweet neglect. Jaime stayed. The light moved in squares on the floor. "What do you fear?" Jaime asked at last. He had a way of asking this that did not invite a lie so much as make space for the truth to sit down if it wanted to. "Nothing," Cersei said, which was an answer and also a declaration. Jaime's look accepted the terms. "Good," he said. "Then we will find out who shows his teeth first when he hears the lion is gone." "Not gone," Cersei said. "Rearranged." At Winterfell, the words came in on black wings and were carried to the Lord of Winterfell, where he stood with leather gloves on in a courtyard whose snow was thin and clean. Eddard Stark took the letter with that careful grave courtesy of his, and the man who gave it bowed as if the bow had more to do with the air than the Lord. For the Starks made men bow as one bows in a hall without being told to. Ned read the lines in which a man he had never liked, had never even liked with resentment, was credited to the earth. The winter light made hard work of seeing, but he had learned to read in hard light. He read once, then again. He remembered Tywin Lannister as one remembers a well. A circumference of stone, a blackness below, a rope that was always taut, as if something was always being drawn up from it. He remembered a field of red at the end of a rebellion, and a castle that had swung its gates open, and the bundled bodies of children who had not done anything other than be born. He remembered the men who had come afterward to explain. He remembered the quiet in Robert's face when Ned had told him. He remembered the moment when you understood that the world had decided something on your behalf and you would either accept it or die refusing. Tywin Lannister had been a fact like winter. Now that fact was altered. Ned imagined the currents that would shift and touch other shores. The king would be moved by the loss as by a signpost removed from a crossroads. Cersei would harden. Jaime. Ned did not know Jaime well, but he knew the look of a man who had done one right thing once and had it held against him. The West would have a new center, and the center would be slightly off. Catelyn came to him through the court. warm in furs, her figure strong, her mouth both generous and firm. She knew from his look that something had changed. He held out the parchment. She read, and her eyes moved as someone's eyes move when they are adding up columns. Then she looked at him and at the white around them, and the air between them shifted into the intimacy of shared thought. "What do you think?" she asked. "I think there is one less man in the world who has never made a mistake," Ned answered and did not smile. "I also think that when a great weight is lifted from one side of a scale, everything else that is balanced upon it will lean and scuff and adjust. It will be a busy spring." Her glove lifted to touch his arm above the gauntlet where he would feel her hand more than see it. "There is talk," she said carefully, "because wives bring you talk like birds bring you strings and bits of gloss. There is talk that the king will ride north." Ned looked at the raven sitting on the stable roof as if the creature had been the one to bring the talk. The king riding north would bring old summers into the yard and make winter's lines blur a little, because Robert would laugh at the cold and knock it aside like a man knuckles a boy good-naturedly out of the path. If Robert came, he would come with hunger, for meat and old stories and admiration, and with his court like a stain that would be slow to wash. If he came, he would ask something Ned did not want to give, and the presence of that question would fill the halls like heat in a confined space. "If he comes, Ned said, because the saying of it allowed him to stand in the doorway of the future without yet going through. "We will do as we have always done." "Which is, we will be ourselves," Ned said, "and we will not be made ashamed of it." When he went to the Godswood later, to stand under the gnarly face of the heart tree and look at the rivulets of red in its bark that made the tree seem to bleed without end, he thought of the way Tywin's death would make ambitions sprout in men like spring weeds, sudden and satisfied with poor soil. He thought of Littlefinger, who would smell opportunity the way a fox smells a chicken fainting in its sleep. He thought of Varys and the spiders and their webs which would have to be remeasured. He thought for a time of the children in his hall and the way they ran when they were allowed to run, the way their breath looked, and he decided not to measure yet the things that might be asked of them. "You will be asked," the tree seemed to say. It did not speak the words, but the familiarity Ned felt in the presence of that whiteness and those eyes that had been carved by a man long dead placed the shape of the sentence in his mind. "You will be asked, and you will take on the asking because that is the shape of your life." "I know," Ned said quietly. The air under the trees always felt older than the air in the yard. "I do not know yet how to say no." In Riverrun the news came as Hoster Tully slept and woke and slept again, the breath rasping in him like a boat's rope along a dock. Edmure took the letter and read it once and thought the lion's death might be good for the river fish. He thought this bold thought and then felt ashamed of it. His father's coughing rose in the background and fell again. Men who had never eaten at Tywin Lannister's table, and who had hidden from his soldiers nevertheless lived beneath the idea of him, the way people live beneath a mountain range that is not in their province but sets all their weather. Edmure stared at the river flashing by and let himself imagine, for a bold moment, a spring without western banners in it. On Dragonstone, Stannis Baratheon received the raven with a face like a shut door. He dismissed his maester and went to stand by a window that made of the sea a map he did not trust. He had not much use for Tywin Lannister alive except to respect him as one respects the enemy of nuance. Stannis thought of the letter like a log taken off a great fire. Others would see that the blaze dimmed and would imagine it no longer dangerous simply because it had shifted tone. They would be wrong. They often were. He rubbed his mouth and felt the prickle of a beard he had not shaved that morning because what did kingship care for shaving? He let himself think the treasonous thought that if Tywin Lannister had been the man on whom the king had relied, Stannis's grievances would have been clearer. He let himself think the pragmatic thought that Cersei would lunge for the reins and that he would not be permitted to be astonished when she did so. He turned from the window and returned to his table with its stubborn lists. The world reordered itself and still required ships. In the Eyrie, Lisa Arryn stroked her son's hair as if the news were a shawl pulled over the child against a draft. She made a sound of sympathy for the queen that contained no sympathy at all. Littlefinger stood in a chamber not far away in which a small fire worked diligently at comfort. He considered what could be bought with a death like Tywin's, and he counted not coin but favors and the length of corridors and the width of thresholds. At Pike, Balon Greyjoy turned the letter over once and left it face down on a table that had not been polished for months. He took 3 steps to a window and watched the sea he preferred. The wind cut like a man's opinion he did not value. He thought briefly of the rock and spat. The West had always called itself stone. The Iron Islands had always called themselves iron. He thought of the way the mainland forgot its raiders when it was busy cutting its own land into pieces. He smiled without humor. In a carved cavern beneath the surface of Casterly Rock, lamps were being extinguished one by one around the bier. The maester smoothed down the linen on the dead man's chest in a gesture that had more to do with the living than the dead. Tyrion stood away from it, in a darkness that did not ask to be chased. "Do you want to say anything?" Kevin asked. "I have said something all day," Tyrion replied. "I will say nothing now. It might be a useful habit to practice." "You are tired." "I am," Tyrion said without complaint. Weariness felt like a cloak that had become wet and heavy and warm, all at once. He could not shrug it off, nor was it entirely unpleasant. It would carry him to sleep because he would be unable to carry it further. When they left the chamber, they moved into a corridor that led toward the old bronze doors on which the lions were to be seen mating, hunting, sleeping. The 3 activities the Lannisters had always encouraged. Tyrion's footsteps matched his uncle's for a few paces and then fell out of rhythm. "What are we without him?" Tyrion asked, for himself rather than for Kevin. "Alive," Kevin said, "and required to be more so." Outside, night had finally decided upon itself. The sea remained smooth as poured oil. In the city below, 1,000 candles burned like the idea of stars. The smell of fish and wine and pitch and smoke rose. Laughter had found itself again, cautious still at the edges of streets, where it could be retrieved if rebuked. Tyrion did not yet drink. He stood in a room whose walls were hung with hunts. He had not gone on in battles. He had not fought, and looked at a table where he had once been a boy pretending to be taller by standing on a stool. He thought of a girl in a field and the way his father's face had looked when he had told Tyrion what he had arranged. He thought of a war that had not yet occurred and of a crown that had been sitting on a head that did not notice the weight had changed. He thought of his sister and the sharpness of her, and of a brother in white who had cut loose the thing that had anchored him and drifted noble and aimless ever since. He slept at last, and his dreams came barely colored at the edges, like old maps. In the capital, Cersei did not sleep. She walked the red keep like a woman measuring a dress for a seam. She listened at doors she had a right to open and at those she did not. She watched the lanterns swing in the courtyards where guards stood and men pretending to be unwatchful paced. She saw the city in the distance as a carpet rolled out indifferently to a throne. She thought of her father's instructions, some of them words, many of them not. And she thought how they had been delivered to her not as gifts but as tests, and how she had always passed, whether he had admitted it or no. She touched 2 pillars with both hands as she moved between them, and felt the stone cold and present and likely to outlast her, as the rock would outlast most that lived on it. At a high window she stopped, because there are places in a castle that require stopping, as a river requires a pause before a fall. She looked at the night and at the bright line along the black of the river, in whose reflection King's Landing drew a dim picture of itself. Somewhere in the darkness a woman cried out, in anger or in love, and the calls of the cocks wove themselves into each other like threads in a coarse tapestry. She thought of the letter that would need to be written to the West, and of the letters that would need to be written to those who thought the West had altered in such a way as to become edible, and she considered whether it would be better to invite them to her table or to let them starve outside it. Jaime found her there, hours later, as the first thin suggestion of morning made a clean line on the water. "Sleep," he said, and she almost laughed, because he meant it as the person who had once lay beside her and knew her breath. "Sleep," he repeated, because he was also the man in white who believed his words could move the world like a lever. "I will sleep when it is advantageous to sleep," she said without turning her head. "Cersei." She turned then, because it had been a night of turning when it did not look like she did. "You will not leave the city," she said. "Was I asked?" Jaime lifted a brow. "Your vows ask you," she said, an irony she enjoyed for the taste of it. "The vows ask me to stay where the king is," Jaime replied. "The king is in the city. So am I." She permitted herself the small nod of satisfaction she would not show anyone else. "Good. Then we will not be made to look as if the West has emptied of blood." He put a hand, his left, on the sill and leaned, the posture careless. "If he were here," Jaime said, and they did not need to explain If he were here, he would say to keep your sword clean and your mouth shut and your eyes open. Cersei finished, a tiny flash at the corner of her mouth like the blink of a knife. He would say to begin at the end of the story and pull backward through it. He would say to spend men like coin only when you are buying something more useful than men. He would say I had married a fool. He would not say he loved me. Jaime did not counter any of those points. He watched the light build itself out of a kind of soundless hammering in the east. He did not leave the world so much as permit it to continue without the interference of his opinions. She inclined her head. "He left it so that I could have mine," she said. "It was time." Jaime's smile finally came. The small sudden one that had saved her many times when she was a girl. The one that had meant understanding, not pity. "It will be interesting," he said, and his voice made interesting sound like an oath and a jest at once. In the West, a boy of 8 with hair like woven straw and a stammer stood near the front of a room. He had never been in before and watched the dwarf speak to men, who seemed to lean toward him in a way that grown men do when someone unlike them has a hold of their attention. The boy had never set eyes on a lord so short, nor on one who made him less nervous merely by using his eyes on him. His mother had spit on a cloth and wiped his cheek before they had entered, and he had thought he would hate forever the things one must do to show respect. Now he was less sure. He did not understand all that was being said, any more than he understood the way a mill worked when one stood inside it and watched the wheels turn, and yet some sense came through all the same. That there was a center that had not been broken, that a thing which had gone on would go on, though perhaps slightly different. After, when the boy and his mother passed within a pace of him, the dwarf had looked at the boy and said simply, "Remember to look where your feet are." The boy had nodded seriously as if given a secret. On the way home, he stepped carefully around 3 puddles he would otherwise have splashed in, and found himself strangely proud. In the Vale, Littlefinger stood with his hands behind his back and admired a tapestry of dubious taste, said to be the work of a northern weaver who had never seen a lion and had based her idea of it on a dog with a comb fixed to its head. He smiled at the lion dog's teeth. It had thought itself fierce. Men made themselves fierce by arrangement as much as by nature. If Tywin Lannister had arranged the world with neat piles of stones, there would be now among those stones certain gaps. He could think of people who would step into them and be lost, and of others who would step into them and pretend they had meant to be there all along. In his mind's accounting, each was worth something. The season turned its face subtly, as if in courtesy to the dead. Days lengthened by a breath, then another. In far fields, the first shoots showed a faith that would be betrayed in every 5th furrow and rewarded in the 4th. The wind from the west carried less chill. In halls from Old Town up to the Wall, men argued more or less loudly, now that the person who had made a kind of argument unnecessary was no longer able to frown at them from a head of a table. Some were loud with relief, some with terror, and most with neither, since men argue as easily as they breathe. Letters went. Seals were pressed. Someone's spy found someone else's pillow and whispered into it. A child came into the world on a day that no one remembered afterward for anything but that, and an old woman with bad knees died outside a sept after lighting a candle to a god who was not in that day. At Casterly Rock, the funeral came in a slow procession of priests and banners and firm dark cloths and quiet music, the drums restrained, the pipes sober. The chamber in which Tywin's ancestors had been arranged in fine order opened to receive him. Tyrion stood among the Lannisters like a punctuation mark that could not decide its place in the sentence. Kevin spoke, and his voice proved sturdy, and Jenna cried once, suddenly, and then ceased as if her tears were soldiers called abruptly to heel. Lancel knelt for a time longer than was required. Young cousins stared as children do at formalities, with a solemnity their elders always mistake for comprehension. When it was done, the West did what it always did. Counted, practiced. It laid out swords to be oiled and lists to be added to. It didn't stop because stopping would have required an acknowledgement the West did not like to make. That one man had made of its certainty a single note in a song now forced to sing in harmony. The harmonies were not yet sweet. They would be or they would not, depending on whose ear was to be trusted. Tyrion sat late that night with a cup he had at last permitted into his hand and stared at the way the candlelight moved in the wine. The cup caught the light and held it and let it go, and he thought of how people can do the same. He wondered whether it would be opportunity or sorrow that would come to him quicker, now that the person who had barred some doors and held others open had passed to a place where doors were metaphors rather than objects. He thought briefly of riding east. He did not. He thought for longer of riding south. He did not. He thought of letters he might write and of letters he might burn after he wrote them and before he read them aloud to himself to judge their music. He blew out the candle when it suited him. In King's Landing, the Queen issued a series of edicts so ordinary and so well-timed that no one could say she had overreached. She adjusted whose hands were on which levers. She changed 2 stewards and corrected a book of assessments that had been wrong for months and that no one had noticed because the wrongness was to the benefit of men with voices. She brought before the king a petition signed by merchants whose ships had seen pirates increase and had not, in recent seasons, felt as compelled to pay the sums one pays to go unnoticed. She used the word stability 3 times in a morning. She said it pleasantly, and with such a fine and practical air that men who would have argued with an argument nodded at the word as if it had always been theirs. It would have been possible to mark this as a transition and then to go on with the next event, but the realm did not move immediately to climaxes. Instead, it collected itself in small decisions and small hypocrisies and small generosities. The war that would later be named did not yet stamp its foot and demand attention. It waited. Men sharpened knives in the manner of men who have always sharpened knives. Women whispered news across wells. Carts with fresh straw on them went down roads that needed attention and did not get it. A traveling singer tried out a rough song about a lion laid low and revised it twice, finding it too clever for countrymen and too dull for courtiers. When the king did ride north, it was as if he had felt the call of 2 different points on the compass at once. The old friendship and the new empty space where a formidable head had been, and chosen the more comfortable of the 2. The riders appeared ahead of their dust at Winterfell, and Sansa, who had always liked the sound of hooves as a kind of music, ran to take a place in a window where she could see the flags unspooling. Arya arrived late and shoved past with an elbow, and Sansa hissed and then forgot to maintain the hiss when she saw the stag on gold flung high. The king himself glowed with his old oversized charm. He dismounted like a man dropping a story on the ground and expected it to be picked up and told for him. He embraced Ned, and Ned's mouth could not help itself into the shape it had when pleased and wary at once. Catelyn felt her life arrange itself around the order this would impose and the disorder it would invite. The children looked with their eyes and could not yet feel with their bones the way a castle swallows a king's visit and takes days to digest it. Robert ate. Robert laughed. Robert insisted on seeing the crypts. Robert spoke a sentence that lasted the length of a corridor and did the work of 12 shorter sentences, at the end of which Ned understood that the hand's chain was to be offered, and Catelyn understood that King's Landing would require more from them than they possessed and would take it regardless, and Arya understood that the crown meant nothing if you could still be commanded to wear a dress to supper, and Sansa understood that songs had not lied so much as they had left out most of the truth. Bran climbed. No one, that first night, said the name Tywin Lannister. The omission had the quality of politeness about it, like the decision not to remark on a stain on a lord's sleeve, though everyone noted the stain and guessed the substance. Cersei stood at Robb's feast in a hall far away and did not smile except when courtesy demanded. She measured people in millimeters. She was gracious to the hosts and to their children for exactly the right number of heartbeats at a time. She watched the king look about him for the friend he remembered and find him only in pieces, and she felt both contempt and something not unlike pity, which she did not sit near. She slept in a room she found inadequate and woke like a blade. And in the west, As the moon rose and fell and rose again, the sea sent its steady breath against the cliff face, patient, attentive, making no speeches. The rock was as it had been the day before and the day before that, and yet not, because inside it men moved differently. Tyrion walked the passage with the slit of a window at its end and saw in the glass his own face and behind it the world larger. He put a hand against the stone and felt it feel nothing. He went to his uncle's chamber and met with Adam Marbrand about horses, and with Roland Crakehall about grain, and with a man whose name he had not known in childhood but whose signature now appeared on a document beside his own. He wrote to King's Landing not because he believed his sister needed his letter, but because he would always prefer that the next word spoken in a conversation be his. He thought, often, about what a world without his father asked of him, and he found that the answer shifted as the day did, changing length and purpose depending on the hour. Sometimes the answer was, be a wit. Sometimes it was, be a wall. Sometimes, more often than he liked, it was, be something you have never been and that no one will thank you for being until they need it from you, at which point they will insist you always were. There was time yet for the great misunderstandings. The crown would still be heavy and unmoored. The North would still be dragged toward a decision. The Riverlands would learn again the sound of hooves. The South would scent advantage and send flowers that meant something other than sweetness. Steel would be drawn and justified. Songs would be written, and verses would be forgotten because the singer got drunk and misremembered, which is how history travels. Before that, there were mornings like this one in which the gulls left out their crying for a time and the surface of the ocean held its breath. And a man could stand in a slit of a window and see his face and the world beyond and wonder which was more true. Tyrion breathed and remembered to look where his feet were. He took one step, then another. The rock held. The sea kept coming. The air filled itself with the small, important noises of living. Somewhere, a boy practiced with a stick that would one day be a sword. Somewhere else, a woman counted coins that would not be enough. Somewhere, two men argued over the meaning of loyalty, and one of them went to bed that night thinking he had won. A raven beat its wings solidly against a stubborn sky and turned its head toward the city where the queen waited with smiling knives. The bird flew on. Its shadow skated briefly over a field that would, if the weather remained kind, produce barley enough for 100 mouths, and then over a road where 3 riders came abreast to save themselves from imagining they were alone. Beyond, the world went on being large, and the lion who had believed himself essential lay in a chamber of stone, dry and dignified, his hands folded as if in a council no longer needed, while the council he had always feared, that of time, was taken up by others, noisier, more foolish perhaps, and on this account more human.